Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with our series of well-tempered symphonies and other things. That is, music that exploits specific keys in an effort to determine if those keys have any special qualities that the pieces written in them share. It's a really interesting historical question, one that comes up quite frequently and it never really gets resolved. So I don't know if we're going to resolve it either, but we'll have a lot of fun making the effort. And today we are in C minor. Now, C minor, I scratched my nose here. There we go. C minor is really a cool key. It's just one of the ones we all love. Why? Because it's the key of Beethoven's Fifth. It was Beethoven's special minor key. It's the Fifth Symphony. It's the Pathetique Sonata. It's the Piano Concerto Number 3. It's so much good C minor stuff by Beethoven. However, we're not even going to get to Beethoven in this talk because this talk is going to be in two parts. It needs to be in two parts. And the reason for that will become evident at the end of part 2. So there's a teaser, something tantalizing to keep you watching and keep you listening. Not that I have any worry about that. But I want to start with the classical period because we need to make some general observations about the key number 1 and number 2. There's a lot of really cool music in C minor also written during the classical period. That is symphonies, which is what we're talking about in this particular case. And I want to go through some of them and play you some music so we can just enjoy it and get to know C minor and see how individual composers handled it in their own special way, because there is really quite a bit of variety in the classical period. It is not, as one thinks, that everything sounds the same kind of thing. The more you get to know the way composers wrote and how they thought and what they did, the more interesting their handling of minor keys versus major keys, their own personal styles, the more evident that will become. However, music begins, as it so often does, with Haydn. And, because we're doing the Haydn Symphony Crusade, we're going to treat all of the pieces we discuss here in some detail. But I want to start with Haydn's Symphony number 52 in C minor. This is considered by many to be the very greatest of all of his Sturm und Drang middle period symphonies, those tense, nervous symphonies in minor keys. But it doesn't have a nickname, so nobody knows it. Nobody pays attention to it. It's such a shame. It's such a great, great, great piece. Haydn actually wrote 3 symphonies in minor keys, numbers 52, 78, and 95. But by far the most important one for our purposes is number 52, because Haydn treats the key of C minor the way Beethoven would later treat the key of C minor, that is, as a key of struggle. And in the first movement of Symphony number 52, the fascinating thing to note is that although it begins in C minor, it begins in a minor key with tense and somewhat angry music, it immediately becomes major throughout almost the entirety of the exposition. And it's only gradually that the key of C minor battles its way back to predominance, to preeminence. And that, in a sense, is the same game plan that Beethoven would employ in his Fifth Symphony much later. But I'm only going to play you the exposition of this symphony, so you're not going to get much of a sense of C minor at all. I leave it to you to listen to the symphony, and there are some splendid performances on YouTube, so you can hear what Haydn does with it in his own special way, because a lot of these other composers will spend more time hovering around C minor, but none of them will get this notion of conflict, of using the minor key as a source of dramatic tension rather than simply as a source of pathos, a source of sadness, a source of anger, a sort of, whatever the emotion associated with that kind of music is, alternating with another emotion. In Haydn, it's a process. And it's the process that's so fascinating. And that's why initially he will start in C minor, but then spend virtually no time there for the rest of the exposition. Here is the opening of Haydn's Symphony number 52 in C minor in the Naxos recording, which is quite fine. And you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Here you go. thus begins our C minor journey, and we'll have a lot more to say about Haydn's handling of it when we get to the other side after the classical period, because like so many things in Haydn, he always does first what others did later. It's really fascinating. For the most part during the classical period, the key of C minor is handled, as I just said, as a source of emotional contrast, but not necessarily as a source of struggle, of strife, of dramatic conflict. And you'll hear that very clearly in these other examples, which reveal some extremely beautiful and attractive music that you really ought to get to know. One of the composers who was a big follower of Haydn was Johann Baptist Vanhal. His dates were, 1739 to 1813, something like that. Yes, he had a good life. He was just about as old as Haydn was, I think. I think he was older. I think he lived to be older. He wrote tons of symphonies. He was a seguaci, the followers, as H.C. Robbins Landon called them, of Haydn. I wrote a bunch of sort of Haydn-esque symphonies until you actually get to listen to them and realize that he has absolutely no relationship in terms of the process of development that Haydn employed, but he still wrote beautiful, beautiful music. And there are at least 2 symphonies that he wrote in C minor out of however many billions he did. Vanhal has Brian numbers. Don't ask me who Brian was. I'm sure he was a very fine musicologist. He cataloged all these things. So here is the Symphony in C minor, Brian C minor 2, little c 2, which means that it's the second symphony he wrote in that key, because the way Brian cataloged these things apparently was by key. For example, this disc has G6. This is the Toronto Camerata under Kevin Mallon on Naxos. And here is the opening of his C minor symphony. And I think that you'll hear that in spite of the fact that he spends probably more time in and around C minor in his exposition than Haydn did, the level of tension is quite different. The way that it's apportioned is different. But here it is. It's a lovely work, and this is a terrific disc, which you very well might want to hear. Vanhal Symphony in C minor. That was the first movement exposition, and a lovely work it is. And notice the attractive writing for trumpets and timpani in the key of C minor, which is rather nice to hear and adds a jet of color and also some militant energy to the music. It's terrific. Next we have the splendid composer who died only at the age of 36. He was a Mozartian age, Joseph Martin Kraus. Now, Joseph Martin Krauss spent most of his time in Sweden, in Stockholm, where he was the favorite of Gustavus III, the assassinated king in Un ballo in Maschera, except that Verdi couldn't do it because the censors wouldn't permit him to write an opera about a royal assassination. So he moved the whole thing to Puritan Boston, which was just insane. But that's where it should be. And when Gustavus III was assassinated, Kraus, whose dates were, 1756 to 1793, I mean, exactly Mozart's basically, lifetime, he composed a wonderful symphonie funèbre, funeral symphony, which is in C minor, and it begins with a fabulous funeral march marked Andante Mesto. Mesto means sad, and sad it is. And in fact, it's quite similar to another famous funeral march, in some respects anyway, Beethoven's in the Eroica Symphony. I don't know if he knew the Kraus, but boy, there was a topos, a topic, a paradigm for C minor or minor key, whether it was C minor or D minor or G minor, whatever it was, funeral music. And this piece fits it to a T. So here is the first movement, the sad funeral march of Joseph Martin Kraus's Symphonie Funèbre in C minor, and this one is with the Swedish Chamber Orchestra under Petter Sundqvist on Naxos. Here you go. Starting to get the hang of C minor, I hope. One of the things about these keys is that you're going to find, as we do the classical period in minor keys, is that there isn't as much of a difference between C minor and G minor and D minor and that kind of stuff. Certain composers had personal minor keys. As I said, Beethoven's was F minor, Mozart's was G minor, which we'll get to, and that will be lots of fun, of course, because we'll be able to play some Mozart. But what makes these keys so interesting is the ability of composers to try and expand the expressive scope of their music while staying within the bounds of classical propriety. And most of them do that by inevitably turning to a major key, at the end of the movement, at the end of the work, some way to make it, to give it a happy ending, no matter how crazy and turbulent it starts with. And, most of them will do that. That's sort of normal. In fact, it stayed normal for most of the 19th century. And, of course, it was only in the hands of Beethoven who made that whole process, something just galvanic and intensely dramatic, whereas these people are being just a little bit more cautious and not stressing the fighting urge in C minor. The next victim we have here is Luigi Bacharini. Now, Boccherini had an incredibly personal style. He was, by and large, a fairly gentle composer. And I don't mean his music lacks tension. What I mean is that he was, being Italian perhaps, he was into vocal, lyrical expression, and he had a tremendous ear. He was a chord guy, a guy for succulent, rich, juicy, magnificent sounds. And, of course, to play him on period instruments with no vibrato is a crime, because his music requires the widest possible range of color for all of the extremely detailed performance instructions that he left. And his symphony, Opus 41, it's a singleton symphony, Opus 41, is in C minor. And it's a totally different kind of C minor from the sort of militant C minor we heard in Kraus and even in Vanhal. It's a nervous, anxious, pathetic C minor. There's pathos and sadness in his C minor, and a great deal of nervous anxiety, but not anger, not brute force. that was just alien to Boccherini's sense of expression. It really was. And this lovely performance is with the Deutsche Kammerakademie Neuss under Johannes Goritzky on the CPO label. Here is a different take. You'll hear in this particular piece, I think, a lot of C minor. There's a lot of minor. But what you find when you hear it this way is that the minor key, the presence of the minor key, the longer you dwell in it, the sadder the overall cast of the music. But it doesn't become more dynamic because of it. It just doesn't. The mood becomes more stable, even if that mood is minor, even if that mood is one of sadness or one of tension or anxiety. It doesn't change so much. What makes these minor keys powerful, and it's the thing that Haydn realizes and that Beethoven really realized and ran with, is contrast. The idea of the minor as something you want to escape from, but you can't, or as something to avoid, but that becomes inevitable, or something which conquers something else. That kind of a process, minor key process, which gradually evolves as the language of classical music evolves throughout the 18th century. So here is a very different approach to a minor key. It's much more similar. It's much closer to Mozart's handling of minor keys, to be honest with you. But here is the Boccherini Symphony in C minor, Opus 41. Lovely, lovely piece. You hear what I mean there? This is not music of extraordinary drama. In spite of the fact that it's very quick, it's very interesting, I think. It's very beautiful and emotionally quite expressive. It's not boring just because something isn't like dramatic, just because, things aren't duking it out or fighting. That doesn't mean that the music is dull. It isn't. It's marvelous. It's beautiful. But it's in a different vein from the kind of approach to minor keys that will soon become the norm. Here it's not yet. We haven't gotten there yet. Next, Franz Crummer. Franz Crummer wrote terrific symphonies. I mean, he was a wonderful composer generally. And, he's famous for his wind partitas and those things. And I've played some of them here. I've done some videos. But he really was a first-class composer. And like all of those Bohemian Czech composers, he was fantastic in writing for woodwinds, even in an orchestral context. And his fourth symphony is in C minor. And this is a wonderfully turbulent, dramatic, exciting piece. It dates from, no one's quite sure when Krommer wrote these things as opposed to when they were published, but it's the first decade of the 19th century. So we're talking around the same time that Beethoven did the fifth. And you certainly hear, I think, a much greater sense of dynamic tension in Krommer's approach to minor keys than we heard in the previous composers. Haydn always accepted, of course, but in these previous composers where the minor key could be any minor but not really C minor. Here I think maybe we're hearing something of that fight that we learn to love in music in C minor. So this is the Orchestra della Svizzera Italiana with Howard Griffiths' first-rate performance of the Krommer Symphony No. 4 in C minor. It begins with a slow introduction. I'm starting right off with the Allegro. Listen to the opening theme of that Allegro. You might have heard it before. Give it a shot. Wasn't that fun? Now, Krummer really knew his Haydn and Mozart. One of the pieces that I talked about was one of Krummer's sort of amusing transcriptions in one of his wind partitas of the slow movement of one of Haydn's Opus 33 string quartets. Well, that main theme of his C minor symphony you may recognize as awfully similar to the second subject of Mozart's G minor string quintet, that do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do. That's Mozart, and Krummer knew his Haydn and Mozart. In fact, he knew Haydn and Mozart, so I mean, it was more than that. But I think you can hear that sense of it, although in this case, I think the energy of the music is just on another level. But now there are two more C minor symphonies, yes, that we're going to listen to just to round out our C minor symphonies in the classical period. One of them is Schubert's Fourth, subtitled The Tragic. Now, there's nothing terribly tragic about it, although the opening introduction is pretty serious. It's very, very serious. But Schubert's C minor is based on Mozart's G minor. And in fact, most of the composers immediately following Mozart, while Beethoven was still alive, in that period, were followers of Mozart. Mozart, after his death, was idolized and was considered, the apotheosis of where music had got to. Beethoven was eccentric and kooky and hadn't been assimilated yet, and so people were busy trying to be Mozart's. And Schubert's early symphonies fall into that general category, and I think his Tragic Symphony definitely falls into that category. It is of the Mozart / minor key variety. So here is the opening, after the introduction, of Schubert's Tragic Symphony No. 4. What a great work, by the way. If you don't know these early Schubert symphonies, Schubert was always great. And although these are immature compared to, the Unfinished or the Great C Major Symphony, which is either No. 8 or 9 or whatever you want to call it, they're marvelous pieces. Dvorak loved them, and Brahms loved them, and they wrote about it. Dvorak did anyway. And he was right. He knew what he was talking about. Schubert's Fourth with the Staatskapelle Dresden under Herbert Blomstedt. Boy, are these great performances. Here you go. This is on Brilliant Classics. It's fantastic. And the whole set's available for like less than $20. If you don't own it, you're out of your mind. There you go. And as you can hear with this, we are still in the classical conception of minor, or the what I would call the not dramatic version of a minor key. It's an affective minor key. It's supposed to have a certain emotional quality which contrasts with the next emotional quality in the other thematic material in the symphony. But the interaction between the two has not become the all-out struggle that we expect from C minor and that would happen much later. And finally, last example I want to play for you is a symphony which is unaccountably neglected and which is absolutely a little masterpiece. It's fantastic. It's Mendelssohn's Symphony Number 1. Why does no one listen to Symphony Number 1? It's thrilling. Yes, it has a certain, the finale is sort of audibly based on Mozart's G minor symphony. A lot of Mendelssohn in the minor was based on Mozart's G minor symphony and other things by Mozart, but it doesn't matter. It's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic and brilliant, wonderful, wonderful work, still written in the shadow of the classical period, but with romanticism about to burst out. And you can hear it in the opening of this symphony, in the very first movement, which I think has one of the most exciting openings of any romantic symphony by anybody. And Mendelssohn sustains it throughout the whole movement. It's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful music. I remember the first time I heard it, I just sat there and just went, wow, why does nobody perform this? I was so sick of the Italian symphony. It's beautiful work, but this is just as good. it's fantastic. So here is the opening of Symphony Number 1 by Mendelssohn. This is with the Heidelberg Symphony, Heidelberger Symphoniker, and Thomas Fye on Hänssler Classic. Just a knockout of a piece, and you owe it to yourself to hear the whole thing because it is stunning. Really, really stunning. Here you go. The Romantic period is like banging down the door there. I think you can hear that pretty clearly, and it's exciting from the first bar. Oh my God, I love this piece. So there we are. This was our classical period and nascent Romantic period C minor excursion, leaving out Beethoven's Fifth, because with Beethoven's Fifth, something fascinating is going to happen to the key of C minor, and I want to give it a talk all by itself because the world was not the same after Beethoven's Fifth, and there will be many other pieces to discuss, many of which you will already know, but and some fun little examples to play as well. So keep on listening, folks. We're just getting started with C minor. I hope you've heard some music that you might not have known so well, giving you some opportunities to explore the key, get comfy with it, and then we'll see where it takes us. Please, please join me for part 2. Thank you.